23rd, 1995, 31-year-old Donna Winger stepped out of the air-conditioned baggage claim exit of the St. Louis airport to look for the van that would take her back to her home in Springfield, Illinois. Next to Donna was a cart carrying all of her luggage. Slung over her forearm was the carrying handle of a child's car seat, and sleeping inside of it was Donna's 3-month-old daughter, Bailey. The 88-degree afternoon was warm, even for August, but not nearly as hot as it had just been in Florida, where Donna and Bailey had just spent the last few days visiting with Donna's dad, mom, stepdad, and 2 sisters. Now tanned and rested from her vacation, Donna couldn't wait to get home to tell her husband Mark about the trip. Feeling very tired, Donna suddenly felt totally relieved that her mother and stepfather had hired a private driver to take her and her daughter the rest of the way home. It was about a 2-hour drive from the airport to her single-story house just outside of the city, and with a private driver, she and her daughter could just sleep the whole time. A minute later, a 27-year-old, lanky, dark-haired man stepped out of a waiting van parked in the limo area and waved at Donna, holding up a handwritten sign that had her name on it. As Donna started to gather her bags, the driver smiled at her and hurried over to give her a hand. A few moments later, he had opened the hatch of the van and stowed the luggage in the trunk, while Donna carefully strapped Bailey and her car seat into the back seat of the van, and then she too climbed inside and buckled up as well. The man hopped into the driver's seat and checked his rear and side view mirrors, then pulled out into the stream of traffic headed for the airport exit. Even though all Donna wanted to do was just sleep, she figured she should wait to see if the driver was the type of person who wanted to make small talk, in which case she could indulge him for a few minutes and then go to sleep, and then she wouldn't be as rude. And sure enough, within seconds of starting the car, the driver wanted to chat. He introduced himself as Roger Harrington and said that he lived in the area. The man seemed nice enough, and for a few minutes they chatted about the weather in Springfield and how it was hotter than usual for August. Then Roger complimented Donna on her tan, to which she kind of laughed off and said she'd just spent the last few days sitting by a pool and probably was more sunburned than tanned. Eventually, Donna's responses got shorter and shorter as she was trying to give the man a hint that she just kind of wanted to be left alone. But he wasn't taking the hint. He just kept on asking her question after question, and eventually, the questions became very inappropriate. He started asking her about her sex life and whether she liked orgies and whether she wanted to come to one of his sex parties. All the while, he'd be looking into the rearview mirror to try to make eye contact with her. Donna felt totally creeped out and began tucking herself into the corner of her seat to try to get out of the view of his mirror. Finally, Donna just told Roger that she did not want to talk to him anymore, that her daughter was asleep and she didn't want their voices to wake her up, but Roger, again, did not take the hint. Instead, his questions and remarks got more and more sexually inappropriate and explicit, and his driving became faster and more erratic. And then he started talking about the voices he heard in his head, like the one belonging to an entity he called Dom that apparently told him to do bad things, and lately Dom had been telling Roger to hurt people. By the time Roger pulled onto Donna's street, Donna was panicking and just praying that he didn't try to hurt her or her child. And so when he pulled up in front of her house, Donna hopped out of the car, grabbed her daughter, and practically ran her into the house. And then she went back outside, and without even looking up at Roger, she just grabbed all of her things and then rushed back inside the house. With her front door shut and locked, Donna looked through the peephole of the door and watched with relief as Roger climbed into his van and drove off. At this point, Donna's husband, Mark, who was an average-sized guy with glasses and dark hair that had begun to thin, he had come into the room. He had been downstairs in their basement using their treadmill. And he was about to ask how the Florida trip went, but he could tell right away that his wife was very upset about something, and so he asked her, what's going on? It would take her a minute to compose herself, but Donna began explaining her car ride and how awful it had been and how she really had been in fear for her life. Mark listened attentively while he held their daughter Bailey, and even though he was calm and reassuring on the outside, inside he was furious. How dare this man put his wife and daughter in danger? So at some point toward the end of her explanation of what happened, Mark told Donna to just write down an account of exactly what happened on the drive so that they could use it later on if they decided to file a complaint. Donna agreed that that was a good idea, and so she stepped away and jotted some notes down on some paper, and then she stuck those notes to the refrigerator door with a magnet. Then, after that, even though both of them were still upset about the whole driver thing, they shifted their focus to their daughter, who was now rolling around on the ground, smiling and cooing. And before long, the couple was down there with her, laughing and goofing around. By the next morning, things in the Winger household seemed to be back to normal. Mark, a nuclear engineer for the state, was getting ready to go to work. Donna was still on maternity leave, so she and Bailey sat in the kitchen with Mark while he ate his breakfast. Married for 6 years, the only source of tension in the Winger household had been Donna's heartbreak years ago when she found out that she could not have children of her own. But the couple got over it, and Mark and Donna filled their lives with family and friends. They were as openly affectionate with each other as they had been when they first got married in 1986. They were very active in their synagogue and were part of its tightly knit Jewish community. The pair complemented each other beautifully. Mark was soft-spoken but had a great sense of humor, and Donna was outgoing with a smile that could light up the room. Everybody loved them. And in June of that year, just 3 months before Donna's trip to Florida, the couple got some amazing news. A teenage mother in the hospital where Donna worked as an operating room medical technician had just had a baby and wanted to place the infant for adoption. Donna and Mark immediately filed the paperwork, and a few days later, on a bright, warm day right outside of their house with family and neighbors looking on, Bailey was delivered into Donna's arms by a man from the adoption agency. Life was perfect. As Mark kissed Donna and Bailey goodbye that morning, Donna's awful encounter with Roger, the driver, had already faded from their memories. But that evening, she and her husband would be forced to talk about him again. That night, when Mark, Donna, and Bailey sat down for dinner, their phone rang. Mark got up to answer it, but when he picked up the receiver, all he heard was silence, and then a few seconds later, he heard a click as the caller hung up. Mark shrugged, hung up the phone himself, and then sat back down with his family, and then just a few minutes later, the phone rang again. Annoyed, Mark got up, answered it, and again, he heard silence, followed by a click. When Mark sat back down the second time, he felt totally unsettled. He couldn't help but think that the person who was calling them had to be Roger. The man had access to their home phone number because it was on their reservation paperwork that they knew he had, and Roger clearly had some serious issues and had shown a very unhealthy interest in Donna. And so as he was thinking about this as a potential possibility, Donna said to Mark, "I bet that was Roger." Even though the phone did not ring again that night, the Wingers remained on edge and triple-checked their locks that night before they went to bed. And then the next morning, when Mark got up, he immediately called Roger's employer, Bootheel Area Rapid Transportation Company, or BART for short, and he filed a formal complaint about how inappropriate Roger had been during the car ride with his wife and his daughter. Mark also told the company that he believed Roger was behind the 2 anonymous hang-up calls he received the night before. The company said they would look into it, and sure enough, later that day, they called Mark back to apologize for Roger's behavior during the car ride, and they told Mark that, as a result, they had given Roger a 6-month suspension. Mark thanked them and felt like justice had been done. He figured if Roger had been behind those hang-up calls too, that perhaps now he would stop, because he would know that Mark and Donna were prepared to take action against him. But the calls didn't stop. For the next several days, the phone in the Winger household rang constantly, and each time there was just silence and then a click. Finally, on the morning of August 29th, so 6 days after Donna and Bailey had returned from Florida, Mark had had enough. He pulled out the paperwork Donna had been given by Roger when she first got in the car with him, and on it was Roger's phone number. Mark dialed the number, and when Roger said hello, Mark very angrily said, "If you don't stop harassing my family with these phone calls, we are going to call the police." And then before Roger could answer, Mark just hung up on him. Confronting Roger directly had been cathartic for Mark. However, deep down, he knew his threat was unlikely to change Roger's behavior. Roger was obviously mentally unwell, and on top of that, he was likely very angry at the Wingers because their complaint had just gotten him suspended. And so these calls, which the police could do almost nothing about, were most likely Roger's way of getting some payback. But Mark figured, all he can do now is just wait and see what happens next. Later that day, just before 4 p.m., Mark was in the basement working out on the family's treadmill when he suddenly heard a thumping sound coming from upstairs. He turned off the treadmill and listened, and he heard it again, more thumping. And so he climbed off the treadmill and quickly walked over to the stairs and went up to the main floor. And when he got up there, he didn't see anything unusual on the floor, so he just walked straight to the master bedroom where Donna and Bailey had last been. But when he looked in the bedroom, Mark was immediately concerned. Bailey was in the middle of the bed, and Donna was not in the room. Donna would never just leave Bailey alone in a place where she could potentially get hurt, like by falling off of the bed. And so Mark knew something was up, and those thumping sounds could not be good. But before he could make sense of what was going on, Mark heard more thumping coming from somewhere on the other side of the house. Mark had a terrible feeling, so he rushed over to Bailey and he put big pillows all around her to keep her from rolling off of the bed. And then he rushed to his bedside table and he pulled out of one of the drawers a pistol that he kept there for protection. Then Mark slowly crept out of the bedroom with the gun at the ready. He shut the bedroom door behind him, and then he turned right and started walking down the hallway toward the dining room, which is where he believed the thumping sounds were coming from. And so as he walked, his heart rate began to spike. He had no idea what was making these sounds or what he was going to see when he reached the end of this hallway. And so finally, he gets to the end of the hallway, but he's still in the hallway, so he can't see what's in the dining room. And so he has his gun at the ready and he takes a deep breath, and then in one fluid motion, he steps into the dining room and turns right and gets a full view of the room to see what's going on in there. And what he sees is beyond horrible. His wife, Donna, is on her knees in the middle of the dining room, and standing behind her is a man Mark has never seen before. And the man is holding a hammer, and he's raising it above his head, and then he brings it down and he smashes it into the back of Donna's skull. There was blood all over the walls. Mark started screaming, and then Donna, she turned and looked at her husband. And then Mark had to watch as this guy raised the hammer again and hit her as hard as he could across the base of her skull, sending her crumpling onto the ground. Mark reflexively raised his gun, pointed it at his wife's attacker, and he fired 2 shots, both hitting the man in the head. The man dropped the hammer, and then he fell backward onto the floor and was motionless. And so, shaking violently from adrenaline and shock, Mark ran to his wife, who's face down in a growing pool of blood, and he put his gun down on the side, and then he grabbed his wife and tried to roll her over to try to help her. But as he did, he heard the sound of this attacker starting to move around, and so without enough time to grab his gun, Mark just turned around and grabbed the hammer that was on the ground between him and this man, and he wound up and he smashed the attacker as hard as he could right in the center of his chest. And when he did, the attacker groaned and went silent. Then Mark chucked the hammer out of reach of the attacker, and he turned his attention back to his wife, who was now unresponsive. In an absolute panic, Mark ran for the phone and he called 911. When the police and paramedics arrived, they rushed inside the house and they found Mark crouched over his wife, who was barely conscious, and he's sobbing over her, and her attacker was only a few feet away. He was lying on his back, and amazingly, he was still alive. He was groaning, even though his head had been destroyed from those 2 gunshot wounds. The police very quickly took 3 pictures in rapid succession of the positioning of Donna and her attacker's bodies, where they were on the ground. Basically, they needed a snapshot of exactly what the crime scene looked like as soon as they arrived. And then the police pulled Mark aside to talk to him, while the medics rushed inside and put Donna and her attacker on stretchers, and then they loaded them into an ambulance that was waiting outside, and they rushed them to the hospital. Right before the ambulance left, one of the police detectives, Charlie Cox, he pulled a wallet out of the back pocket of the attacker. And inside the wallet, Detective Cox found a driver's license, and it belonged to 27-year-old Roger Harrington. Sitting inside the bedroom he shared with his wife, Mark sat on the edge of the bed staring off into space while asking over and over again if his wife was going to be okay. At first, the police really weren't saying much since they knew Mark was in shock. But eventually, Detective Cox asked Mark if he had recognized his wife's attacker. Mark said no, but then he looked up suddenly, his eyes seeming to focus for the first time, and he said to the detective, "It has to be Roger Harrington." After explaining why he thought that, Detective Cox would tell him that yes, it was Roger. As it dawned on Mark that Roger's attack might well have been triggered by the complaint he filed, as well as the phone confrontation he had with him, Mark broke down completely and just began sobbing hysterically. Meanwhile, Roger Harrington would die on his way to the hospital. As for Donna, she would die too, just 40 minutes after arriving at the emergency room. It turned out that Roger Harrington was already known to area police. He had been a psychiatric patient at a local treatment facility, Although he did not have a criminal history, Detective Cox himself had once had to respond to a domestic dispute between Roger and his then wife. And in addition to Mark's report of the harassing phone calls and his complaint to Roger's employer, the detectives had also discovered Donna's handwritten note on the fridge that detailed exactly what this guy had done in the car ride with her just 6 days earlier. It all added up to a tragic pattern of obsession and violence. Losing his job had apparently been the last straw. Roger Harrington had snapped. And now Donna Winger was dead. Her baby was again motherless, and Mark's life was shattered. Over the next several months, Donna's family would all take turns flying from Florida to Springfield to help Mark take care of Bailey while he tried to put his life back together. Not only was the extended family devastated by their own loss, they were also horrified by what Mark must have gone through, what he had seen, and what he had been forced to do. And it was obviously taking a toll on him because he had begun drinking heavily. Finally, Donna's mother just stepped in and told Mark, look, you really need to go out and hire a nanny who can come in and live with you guys and take care of Bailey, kind of help you get back on your feet again. And so with the encouragement and assistance of Donna's mother, Mark Wood put an ad out for a live-in nanny. And at the start of 1996, he hired 23-year-old Rebecca Simic, a recent college graduate who had always wanted to work with children and who felt sure she could help fix this broken family. About 4 months later, Donna's mother was hurt, but not totally surprised, when Mark called her to say that Rebecca was pregnant. But Donna's family really liked Rebecca. She was not only amazing with Bailey and with Mark, but she also was just very respectful of the situation she was in. And in many ways, she represented a way forward for Mark and for Bailey, and so Donna's family gave the couple their blessing. And at the end of the year, Mark and Rebecca eloped to Hawaii for a quiet wedding ceremony, and then over the next 4 years, Mark and Rebecca went on to have 3 children of their own. They also left the house where Donna was killed and moved to a larger house in the country with room enough for their growing family. Eventually, Mark withdrew both from Donna's family and from the tight-knit Jewish community that had been such a big part and reminder of his life with Donna. He also lost touch with their rabbi and converted to Christianity. But despite these changes, Mark never forgot about Donna. Even though the investigation into her death was officially closed, Mark periodically would stop in to the Springfield police station to ask them if they had learned anything new about Roger Harrington's motivation for this crime. Mark knew that Roger was unhinged, but the attack just seemed so random. Roger had only met Donna a few days earlier. What could possibly drive him to kill her so quickly? Even though her attacker was dead, Mark felt determined to see to it that someone be held accountable for Donna's death. And so Mark filed a lawsuit against BART, the transportation company that had employed Roger. Mark claimed that BART was negligent in hiring Roger, and they should have known that he was dangerous. With millions of dollars in potential damages at stake, BART attorneys began their own investigation into the circumstances around Donna's death. But years would go by and the lawsuit just kind of dragged on quietly and no new developments were discovered. But all that would change in 1999. In February of that year, the Springfield police got a call from a local woman who made an outlandish claim. She said there was another person besides Roger Harrington that was involved in Donna's murder, and she gave the police their name. Now, police get lots of tips, and many of them are not useful or not true. But the detective who received this tip had been directly involved in investigating Donna's murder back in 1995, and he had always kind of had his doubts about the way the crime scene was interpreted at the time. And so after getting this tip from this woman, the detective decided to review some of the evidence from Donna's case, and very quickly he noticed a discrepancy. Those 3 pictures that were taken by police right when they arrived on scene that showed in the same picture Donna and Roger, well, those pictures had just been slipped into the case file as an afterthought, and until that moment, no one had really looked at them closely. But now, thinking about the possibility of another person being involved in this murder, these 3 pictures took on a whole new meaning to this detective. These photos, along with the tip from this woman and later combined with evidence unearthed by BART's investigators, would reopen the Donna Winger case. And eventually, after another 2 years of painstaking interviews and forensic examination, the police learned that there really was another person involved in Donna's murder, and there was much more to the story than they had originally thought. This is the full story of what happened to Donna Winger. At about 3:45 p.m. on August 29, 1995, so the day Donna died, Mark was in the basement on the treadmill when he heard a thumping sound coming from upstairs. After turning the treadmill off, he listened and heard the thumping again, and so he quickly walked over to the stairs and began heading up to the main floor. When he got up there, he looked around and he didn't see anyone or anything strange, but instead of going to the master bedroom to check on his wife and daughter like he had told police, Mark walked to the front door. The thumping he had heard downstairs was just the sound of someone knocking on the door. When he looked through the peephole of the front door, he saw a man in his mid-20s standing there. Mark opened the door, and then this young man introduced himself as Roger Harrington. Mark said hello and gestured for Roger to come inside of the house. Roger did and walked straight to the nearest table, which was in the dining room, and when he got there, he placed his cigarettes down on top of it, as well as his travel cup that contained some coffee, and then Roger turned around to face Mark. And when he did, he saw Mark was now holding a pistol out in front of him. Roger was so shocked he just froze and stood there, not saying or doing anything, and then Mark ordered Roger to turn around and get on his knees. And once Roger did this, Mark simply raised his gun and fired a single shot into the back of Roger's head. Hearing the gunshot, Donna, who was in the master bedroom with their daughter Bailey, she came running out to see what was going on, and when she got to the dining room where Roger was on the ground in this pool of blood, she saw him and had no idea what to make of it, and just started crying and shaking and looking around wildly, wondering what was happening, and as she stood there, her husband, Mark, snuck up behind her with a hammer in his hand. His first blow struck her on the left side of her head. She never saw it coming. And then as she stumbled, she turned and tried to put her arms up over her head to protect herself, but it wasn't enough. Mark bludgeoned her skull over and over and over again while she screamed at him to stop. Eventually, after the seventh blow to her head, Donna crumpled onto the ground next to Roger. Once he was sure his wife was down for good, Mark picked up the phone and placed a hysterical call to 911. In the background, barely audible, you can hear a groan. It was Roger. At that point, Mark abruptly ends the call with the dispatcher saying his baby is crying and he has to go take care of her. But in reality, after he hung up the phone, Mark walked over to Roger and just fired another shot into his head, this one going straight through his forehead. Then Mark picked up the bloody hammer and struck Roger one time as hard as he could in the chest. Mark knew the police would find his prints all over the hammer, so he needed a story for why that was. He would later tell police that as he tended to his wife, he thought he heard Roger moving toward them, at which point he didn't have time to grab his gun, and so he turned around and he grabbed the hammer that was on the ground, and he hit him that one time. With his wife's blood streaking his face and arms and soaking into his t-shirt, Mark attempted to rearrange the two bodies to make it look like Roger had been attacking Donna from behind when he was shot down. Then, right as he got the bodies basically the way he wanted them, he heard the sirens fast approaching, and so he got himself into position. When the police and medics rushed inside the house, they found Mark sobbing over his wife's nearly lifeless body. Mark had actually done a fairly good job of framing Roger for this murder. However, he had made a critical mistake, and those three photographs the police took of Roger and Donna's bodies right when they arrived on scene proved it. In those pictures, you can see that Roger is lying at an angle that was inconsistent with Mark's description of what happened. Basically, the way Roger's body was found, it would not have been possible for him to have been attacking Donna at the time he was shot, which meant Mark's story was a lie. It would turn out this whole murder had just been a crime of opportunity. The tipster who had called the police and suggested that another person had been involved in Donna's death was a woman named Deanne Schultz, and Deanne told them that she was Donna's best friend and that Donna's husband, Mark, was her killer. Deanne said she knew this because she had actually had an affair with Mark shortly before Donna's death, and apparently it had been a very intense relationship where they had exchanged wedding bands and vowed to be together, and during this affair, Mark had started telling Deanne that life would be so much better for the two of them that they could finally be together for good if Donna just died. Deanne did not think he was serious and so never thought much of it, But it would turn out Mark was very serious. He just needed to figure out a way to kill his wife without getting caught. And so when Donna came home from Florida and talked about how inappropriate her driver Roger had been and how he had seemed totally crazy and dangerous, Mark realized he had found the perfect fall guy. He started framing Roger by complaining about him to his company and getting him suspended. And then as for those anonymous hang-up calls, the only person who ever answered the phone for them was Mark. And so most likely he fabricated those. Deanne said Mark believed if he could just find a way to get Roger to come inside of his house when Donna was home, Mark could pull this murder off. Investigators tracked down phone records that showed that Mark Winger had called Roger Harrington on the morning of Donna's death, August 29th. Roger's family corroborated that Roger had received a call from Mark that day, and that Mark had apparently asked Roger to come over to his house so they could resolve the complaint Mark had placed against him. And since Roger desperately needed his job back, he happily agreed to go, not realizing that Mark was luring him to his death. Deanne claimed that at the time, despite how specifically Mark was talking about this frame job, she still was not taking him seriously, which is why she didn't go to police about this. But after Donna's murder, Deanne knew Mark had done it. However, Mark had told her that she could never go to police because she knew too much, and if he went down, she would too. So she had stayed quiet and eventually broken up with Mark and moved on with her life. But 4 years after the murder, her conscience got the best of her, and so she contacted police. Deanne would receive immunity for her testimony. On June 5th, 2002, after a 3-week-long public trial in which he declared his innocence, Mark Winger was found guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Immediately after Mark's conviction, his second wife, Rebecca, divorced him and changed her last name back to Simic. She packed Bailey and her other 3 children into her brother's car, and she relocated to Louisville, Kentucky. As of today, all 4 of the Simic children have grown into successful adults who have built careers in teaching, art, and business. I had just failed a very stressful and anxiety-inducing underwater test as part of Navy SEAL training, and after I failed this test, my instructor told me to get out of the pool and go over to the corner with the other failures. And so I made my way to the edge of the pool, I climbed out, and I sulked my way to the corner where I saw my other classmates who had met a similar fate on this test. They were all sitting in the corner with their backs to the pool in neat rows. And so I was totally gassed from this test. And so when I sat down, I started dramatically breathing really loud and heaving my chest up and down to show off just how hard my test had been. And about 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance of mine, one of my other classmates who had been sitting in the corner when I showed up, a big 18-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Ephraim Matos, he immediately turned around and made eye contact with me, and through gritted teeth, he just goes, "Shut up! Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around. And immediately, I was actually really mad at him because he just totally publicly dimed me out in front of my other classmates. But then it dawned on me, he was right. The job we were trying out for, Navy SEAL, they're not looking for people who just feel bad for themselves all the time. And so I never forgot the lesson Ephraim Matos taught me on the pool deck that day. And I, along with everybody else in the SEAL teams, never forgot the totally insane thing that Ephraim Matos did 5 years later that was picked up by virtually every major news network at the time. Back in 2012, so about a year after our exchange on the pool deck, Ephraim and I graduated and became Navy SEALs. I was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team, and he was assigned to a West Coast one. And over the next 5 years, I never saw the guy until I saw him on TV. It was mid-June 2017, and I was on base in Virginia in an office full of other Navy SEALs, and we were wrapping up for the day. I was closing my email and powering down my computer, and I noticed my phone that was sitting on the table suddenly started lighting up with all these text messages from current and former teammates. And so I grabbed my phone, and all the messages said the same thing: turn on the news. And so in this office we were in, there was always a TV that was turned to the news sitting in the corner that was on mute. And so I turned to look at this TV, and on the TV from a distance, all I can see is breaking news and Middle East. And so given our profession, news like that tended to have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. And so I assumed all these text messages must be about whatever happened in the Middle East. And so I get up, I walk over, I grab the remote, and on my walk back to my seat, I'm turning the volume up, and everybody else in the room is turning around to watch the TV as well. And we start hearing the TV reporters talking about this group of American civilians that had gone to Iraq and taken up arms against the terrorist organization ISIS. And so as they're talking about this group of American civilians, they put on the screen an image of one of these Americans. It was this big bearded guy in his mid-20s carrying an AK-47 rifle standing behind a tank somewhere in the Middle East. And as soon as I saw that picture, I knew right away why I had gotten that flurry of text messages from current and former teammates. It's because we all know this guy. The guy on TV was Ephraim Matos. 5 years earlier, after our graduation, Ephraim checked into his first SEAL team out on the West Coast, and very quickly after he showed up, they deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, Ephraim was in the back of his patrol as they walked across this huge open field as they left this village they had just been in. And so Ephraim, in virtue of being in the back of the patrol, was in charge of looking behind the unit and make sure no one was coming after them. And so Ephraim periodically would turn around and he would look and make sure no one was following them. And then at some point when he turned around, he saw two little girls that couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old running out of the village and start running down the road towards them. Now, earlier in the day, when Ephraim and his team had been in that village, they had found a children's backpack lying in the middle of the road. And when they went up to inspect it, it turned out to be rigged with explosives. Now, no one had gotten hurt. They had defused the explosives, but they were very weary for children's backpacks. And so as Ephraim sees these two girls running up to him, he can see they're both wearing similar style backpacks to the one they found in the road. They were suicide bombers. Ephraim began screaming at these girls to stop, go back, don't come any closer, or I'll have to shoot at you. But he could tell they weren't stopping. They were just running up the road. He could see there were tears coming down their face. They were totally upset. They were obviously innocent. They were young kids. They'd been put up to this by the Taliban. But Ephraim, because he was in the rear security of his patrol, he had to deal with them like they were threats. And so at some point when they wouldn't stop, he raised his rifle up, he flipped the gun off safe, and he put his reticle right on one of the girls, and he began applying pressure to his trigger. But right as he was about to squeeze and fire a shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It's like they knew they were about to be shot. And they turned around and they ran back towards the village. And so Ephraim put his finger off the trigger, he flipped it back on safe, he lowered his rifle, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. But even though he didn't have to engage these poor girls, that experience totally haunted Ephraim. In fact, of all the combat he got in on that deployment, that experience with those innocent girls had the most impact on him. How could anybody force a child to be a suicide bomber? How could anyone be that cruel? And so by the time Ephraim came back to the United States after that deployment, he had changed. That experience specifically had changed him. Even though he believed in the US government's mission over in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, he felt like he could be doing more for these poor innocent people that were just trapped inside of conflict zones like these two little girls. And so over the next few years, he began looking at different conflict zones all over the world where civilians were in the most danger. And he discovered there was one place that was killing and exploiting civilians at an unprecedented rate. And that place was Iraq, where a new terrorist organization had taken power called ISIS. So in early 2017, when Ephraim's Navy contract ran out and it was time for him to decide if he wanted to stay in the SEAL teams or get out and become a civilian, he opted to not re-enlist, so he left the military, and instead he got on social media and he contacted a foreign volunteer group in Iraq that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians. And he reached out to them and he said, "Hey, can I join you?" And of course, they said, yes, we'd love to have a Navy SEAL come out and support us. And so just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house, he packed up a bag of clothes and a backpack, he grabbed his passport, and he hopped on a plane and he flew to northern Iraq all by himself. Now, before we continue the rest of the story, you need to understand just how bold this move was by Ephraim. Now, when he was a Navy SEAL, and so a member of the United States military on active duty, when he went to Afghanistan, to a war zone, he had lots of support. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike or they could call in backup. If Ephraim got hurt on the battlefield or his teammates got hurt on the battlefield, they could call in special medical teams that would fly in virtually any condition to come save them. And if Ephraim got captured by the enemy, you better believe America is coming for him. But in this case, Ephraim went to a war zone as a civilian. He was not in the US military, so he didn't have any of that support. If he or his team got pinned down out in Iraq, they would either have to fight their way out or get killed or captured. If he or one of his new teammates from this volunteer group got hurt, they would have to either save themselves or get killed or captured. And if Ephraim got captured as a civilian, nobody's coming for him. Nobody even knows he's been captured. He is completely on his own. But Ephraim knew these risks. In fact, he knew them better than most people because he had already deployed to a war zone and saw how important it was to have a support infrastructure. So when he flew to Iraq as a civilian, he knew he was hanging it out there, but he just didn't care. He felt like he had a mission to go help these innocent people because nobody else was. When he arrived in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by one of the guys from this volunteer group Ephraim was going out to join. He was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky, and he said he had been a Marine, and while he was in the Marines, he had deployed to Iraq, so he was familiar with the area. The pair hopped in a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the volunteer group's safe house in the city, where Ephraim got a chance to meet the leader of this group. It was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces guy in his mid-50s named Dave. And Dave, for the past several decades, had been going out to conflict zones all over the world, and he would tell Ephraim that the worst atrocities he had seen committed against civilians in any of these places was where they were right now, in Iraq at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers loaded up into this convoy made up of armored ambulances, and they left the city and they headed west into the countryside towards a huge city called Mosul that 3 years earlier had been captured by ISIS. On their journey towards the city, Ephraim and the others had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Now, most of these checkpoints were stood up by their ally, the Iraqi army. But Ephraim and the others knew that they might stumble upon an ISIS checkpoint, and in virtue of all of them being pale-skinned Americans, they would instantly be recognized as the enemy and fired upon. So every time they slowed down for one of these checkpoints, Ephraim and the others would clutch their guns closely and mentally prepare themselves for a potential vicious close-quarters fight to the death. But luckily, they managed to go the entire distance all the way to the outskirts of Mosul without any checkpoint drama. And once they got there, they linked up with an Iraqi army unit that the leader of this volunteer group, Dave, had a relationship with. Over the first month that Ephraim was in country, he worked with this Iraqi army unit to help distribute food and provide medical care to civilians in and around Mosul. Then, in month 2 of his stay in Iraq, everything changed. Iraqi decision makers decided it was finally time to retake Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge military movement that required several units to work together and would take several weeks. The main Iraqi army was going to push inside of the city limits of Mosul and inch by inch reclaim territory from ISIS, while the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with would be responsible for reclaiming some of the villages around Mosul that ISIS had occupied. And so suddenly, Ephraim and the rest of his volunteer group went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct frontline combat role with the Iraqi army. And in his first civilian combat experience, Ephraim ran across an active minefield towards this village that was occupied by ISIS. And after nearly being blown up at least 2 times, Ephraim finally made it to this village, and he began going house to house with the other volunteers, clearing them of ISIS fighters. And in one instance that he has on camera, he entered into this structure and he saw there were guns on the ground, and they looked around and they couldn't find any ISIS fighters inside, but they noticed on the ground there was a piece of plywood. They moved it aside and it revealed this huge hole that led down into the ground, and this hole connected to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to escape gunfights just like this one. And so Ephraim and Dave, who was with him, just hopped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision, they didn't have backup, just the two of them start running down this totally pitch black tunnel, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them in case there are ISIS fighters ahead of them. And at some point, after running for quite a while, just getting ready to come in contact with their adversaries, they reach this big high-ceilinged cavern that's a dead end. And they're looking around thinking, okay, I guess no one ran in here. But before they turned around and left the tunnel system, they looked up with their lights and they saw high up on the wall, dug into the wall, was another entrance to another tunnel. it looked like there needed to be a ladder to get up to this additional tunnel entrance. And so Ephraim and Dave look at each other and they're thinking, I bet ISIS fighters ran down here, there was a ladder, they climbed up and went in that entrance and then pulled the ladder up so we can't follow them. And so Ephraim and Dave couldn't do anything about it. They decide, okay, well, we'll just go out and we'll tell the Iraqi army and see what they want to do. And so Ephraim and Dave, they leave this tunnel system, they go back outside, they tell the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army brings in a bulldozer and they fill in that entrance they had found inside of the house, completely seal it up so nobody could go in or get out. And then later that night, after that village had been cleared of all ISIS fighters, they began hearing muffled explosions underground near where this entrance to this tunnel was. And what it turned out to be was ISIS fighters that realized they had been buried alive. They had snuck down there. They had used a ladder to get up into that crawl space. But when they realized they were doomed, they blew themselves up. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi army unit that he and his volunteers were working with continued to periodically get into small skirmishes with ISIS in these villages outside of Mosul, but the majority of their time was spent providing humanitarian aid and medical care to civilians in the area. Then in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been sent directly into Mosul a month earlier to inch by inch eradicate the area of ISIS fighters, they had done a relatively good job, but the last few ISIS fighters had been pushed up into this northern section of the city where they had bunkered down inside of these blown out concrete structures, and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. So fierce, in fact, that these Iraqi army units in the city were not able to go any farther forward. They needed armored vehicles and tanks if they were going to be successful. And it just so happened the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with, that had been outside of Mosul this whole time, they were an armored unit. They had armored vehicles and tanks. And they were ordered to head right into the heart of Mosul and liberate it once and for all. And so on May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded up in their armored vehicles and they joined this huge line of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles looking at the western side of Mosul. There was just a field between them and the city walls. And as soon as this massive convoy began moving forward towards the city just opened up on them. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket fire, mortars. It was just absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming, and so they were unleashing everything they had on them. And Ephraim would say, after his vehicle actually got inside of the city limits of Mosul and was on one of their roads, all these booby-trapped cars began detonating all around them, and the machine gun fire and rocket fire and mortar fire only intensified. At the same time this was happening, Iraqi civilians inside of Mosul saw this unbelievable wave of violence happening, and they began trying to flee the city. Now, ISIS had effectively kept them hostage inside of Mosul because they needed lots of civilians in and around the area because it prevented Iraq and America and other forces that were fighting ISIS from indiscriminately bombing Mosul to get rid of the ISIS presence there. And so when ISIS saw these civilians running away, they began shooting them to deter other civilians from trying to escape. And so right in front of Ephraim, as he's driving into the city, men, women, children are just being gunned down all over the place. Naturally, Ephraim and the other volunteers hopped out and tried to return fire at these ISIS shooters, but they were so well fortified in different structures, they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others began putting themselves out in the open to draw fire on themselves so that other nearby civilians could run to safety. And for the next 3 days, that's what they did, constantly exposing themselves and dodging bullets. And then also, when they weren't doing that, they were treating these civilians that had been wounded and other Iraqi soldiers that had been wounded. Now, to this point, Ephraim had seen combat when he was in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL, and he'd seen combat as a volunteer with this group. But it wasn't until he got inside of Mosul that he saw just how barbaric humans can be to one another. He said he saw so much death and dying all around him that it was like his brain couldn't compute that level of barbarism. He would later write a book called The City of Death, and it was about his experience in Mosul. And he said the reason he named the book The City of Death is because that's what it felt like. Everywhere around him was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in the south section of Mosul inside of this bombed out building. They created a sort of aid station, and there they focused all of their attention on trying to treat as many wounded civilians and wounded Iraqi soldiers as they possibly could. At the same time, the rest of the Iraqi army had pushed north and was slowly chipping away at the last few ISIS fighters. On June 1st, so roughly 1 month after Ephraim and the others have entered into the city of Mosul, refusal, they noticed a significant uptick in the number of wounded civilians that were coming to them for help. And so all day and all night, they're treating all these people that are horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and other wounds. And so at some point, Ephraim and the others begin asking these people, what happened to you? This seems unusual that so many people would show up with these wounds. And they all just seemed to be in shock. No one was able to really talk about what happened, but a few people mentioned there had been a massacre somewhere nearby. But when they pried for more information, there was a language barrier issue, and there was just the fact that they were overwhelmed with patients, and they needed to make sure their focus was on treating them, not talking to them. The following morning, though, Ephraim and the others got up and decided they wanted to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if there was evidence of a massacre, to try to figure out what happened to all these people that were showing up wounded. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers, they left their aid station building and they moved north about 1 block to this huge intersection, and there they tucked up against this huge concrete wall that protected them from ISIS. ISIS was down the other road that ran through the intersection. They were holed up in this huge bombed out hospital that overlooked this intersection. And so from where they were, ISIS couldn't see them and they couldn't shoot them. At some point, Ephraim poked his head around this wall, looking down the road towards this burned out hospital, and what he saw along the road shocked him. There were dozens and dozens of civilians that had been killed laying all over the place. It would turn out the day before, a huge group of civilians had attempted to flee the city, and they ran in front of that burned out hospital where ISIS was, and they gunned them down. Killed over 200 civilians, men, women, children, they didn't care, and they wounded at least 100 others. And so that was why there was that huge uptick in wounded civilians the day before. And so as Ephraim is scanning this carnage, being careful not to stay exposed for too long, he notices one particularly large pile of bodies. There's about 20 or 30 bodies. He sees in this pile, there's clearly movement. And he can see there is a little girl who's attempting to hide herself under her dead mother's clothing. And then next to this girl were 2 other adult men that clearly were wounded, but were alive. Ephraim immediately starts yelling to them to run to him, you're gonna get killed out there. But the 3 of them were completely shell-shocked. For the past 24 hours, they had been laying inside of this pile of bodies. And so they were not going to be able to move on their own. And so Ephraim realized unless they did something to get them out of there, they were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army counterparts, and they got them to sign off on a rescue mission. And their plan was they would have one of the Iraqi tanks drive down that road straight towards that hospital where all the ISIS fighters were, and right behind the tank would be an Iraqi Humvee, inside of which would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. And so they would go straight down the road, the tank would serve as a sort of shield for the Humvee, and after the tank passed the pile of dead bodies, the Humvee would be lined up right next to it. Ephraim and the others would hop out, they'd grab the girl and the 2 other men, pull them back in the Humvees, and then the 2 vehicles would back up to safety. Once this plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave and the other volunteers contacted the American military in the area, and they got them to authorize a smoke screen. They would fire artillery shells with airburst smoke grenades that would obscure the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't actually be able to see the tank or the Humvee or this rescue operation taking place right in front of them. And so shortly after these plans are totally finalized and Ephraim and the others are loading up in the Humvee and they're getting in position to turn that corner and begin this operation, the driver of the Humvee says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. It's not safe. I'm not willing to do it. Ephraim and the other volunteers tried to convince him to still do the operation because they didn't have time to get a replacement Humvee, and they had already coordinated with the American artillery units that were going to be firing these shells at a certain time, and so they really didn't have an opportunity to do this operation again if this guy backed out. Not to mention, if they didn't get out there quickly, these 3 people were going to die anyways. And so finally, when Ephraim realized this driver was not going to budge, he was not going to go in this operation, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee and they walked up to the tank driver and they asked him, are you still prepared to go on this rescue operation? And he said he was. And so even though if they went through with this mission, it would mean Ephraim and the others would be on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they were still totally down for doing it. In fact, Ephraim would say at no point did they consider canceling the mission. They were so focused on saving these 3 people that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to do it. And so the tank driver closed his hatch, Ephraim and the others got behind the tank, they turned that corner so they're facing the hospital, and then a couple minutes later, as planned, American artillery launched these airburst smoke grenades that totally obscured ISIS's view. And as soon as those smoke clouds were in the air, ISIS came out and just started firing randomly straight down in the general direction of where this tank was. They couldn't really see the tank. They had no way of knowing what they were doing out there. They just knew something was going on. And so meanwhile, Ephraim and the others are tucked up behind this tank as it's slow rolling in, as rounds are impacting all around them, mortars start landing all around them, and it turns out there were other ISIS fighters, not just directly ahead of them in the hospital, but also off to their side in other buildings. So they were getting hit from 2 directions. Ephraim remembers as he was behind this tank trying to stay as small as he could, he began dry heaving because he was so terrified. He was completely convinced he was going to die that day. Eventually, the tank made its way just past this pile of bodies, and at that point, Ephraim actually stepped out and fired back towards ISIS in the hospital and over towards the berm to provide some cover fire, while Dave and another volunteer ran over and pulled the girl and the other 2 men out of the pile and behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were okay. They were not badly physically hurt, but the other man was badly hurt and he couldn't walk. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim and his team found a piece of sheet metal on the ground behind this tank, and they rolled him onto it and used it like a stretcher and began dragging him as the tank began moving in reverse. And so as bullets are still flying all around them, rockets are landing next to them, they're moving, they're making good progress, when the wounded man slips off of the sled and he lands right in the tracks of where this tank is going to go. And for a variety of reasons, Ephraim and the others had no way of communicating with the tank driver. So the tank driver is just going to keep on moving and he's going to run over this injured man who can't go anywhere. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim leaps down, he grabs the injured guy, and he rolls with him out of the way of the tracks right as it goes past him. But now Ephraim and this wounded man are outside the protection of the tank, and rounds start impacting all around them. The smoke screen at this point is pretty much cleared, and so ISIS sees them. And Ephraim at this point makes a heartbreaking decision. He looks at this guy who he knows cannot move himself. He's badly wounded. He makes eye contact with him. He holds his hand, and Ephraim just shakes his head and says, "I'm sorry," because he knew he couldn't move him fast enough behind the tank before both of them got shot, and he couldn't throw him on his back in time before both of them got shot. And so he had to leave him. And so Ephraim jumped up, he leapt behind the tank right as a volley of fire hit right where he had been standing, and then Ephraim and the others continued moving back. That wounded man would go on to be killed by ISIS. Only a few moments after Ephraim was back behind the relative safety of the tank, he suddenly fell to the ground and felt a pain in his right leg. He had been shot through the leg. But where he fell was right in line with where one of these tank treads were coming. But again, they can't talk to this tank, so they can't stop the tank from running him over. And so a surge of adrenaline came over Ephraim, and he leapt up onto his feet and just continued hobbling behind the tank despite this gaping hole in his leg. Eventually, they made it all the way back to that intersection where they had started, but the only way they could get back down the alleyway to safety with the Iraqi army was to run across a small segment of this street. Basically, you needed to be exposed for just a second running across. But at this point, the smoke screen was gone. ISIS knew exactly where they were, and they were waiting for them to pop out from behind that tank. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers are screaming across this gap in the road towards the Iraqi army to get them to send an armored vehicle across this road, pick us up, and bring us back across. We can't run across this gap without getting shot. But because of the chaos and the noise, the tank is firing, there's mortars, there's rockets, there's gunfire, it's crazy, the message was just not received. And so in a sudden fit of madness and frustration and fear and all sorts of things, Ephraim just runs across the street. And he gets to the other side miraculously without being hit again. And there he tells the Iraqi army, send an armored Humvee across this gap, get the girl, get the guy, get the rest of the volunteers, save them. Seconds later, an armored Humvee crossed that gap. They picked them up and brought them back. And at this point, Ephraim is now lying on the ground behind that concrete wall. So he's relatively safe, and he's getting his leg bandaged up. And he remembers when the girl and the guy were brought out and they were safe and alive, 1995, the Iraqi army erupted in cheers. It was this unbelievably happy moment in an absolutely tragic, horrible time. The Iraqis would transport Ephraim in an armored ambulance to an aid station south of where this intersection was, and there they would put him on a cot, and a doctor would rebandage his leg, and then he would walk away. And so Ephraim is left inside of this room to kind of think about what had just happened, and he looked over to his left, and just 2 beds over from him was the girl he had just nearly died saving. And she was sitting on her cot. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead. Her dark hair was matted down, and she was just kind of staring into nothingness. It was clear she was still in shock, but she did look relatively unhurt. And then at some point, another Iraqi doctor came over and gave her some food and water, and she ate and drank ferociously. Ephraim just stared at her in awe. At that moment, she was the most important thing in his life. And as he's staring at this miracle child, the doctor that had given her food and water noticed him staring, and he came over to Ephraim and he just said, "Her name is Demoa. She's 4 years old, and she's going to be just fine." After the doctor had walked away, Ephraim pulled his hat down over his face and he just wept. Ephraim never had a chance to actually speak to Demoa because she was so scared of everyone around her that he decided to just give her her space. But he would later find out that she was reunited with her living family members, and today she is alive and well. After his injury, Ephraim was sent back to the United States, and it was then that he learned their rescue operation had been filmed by a guy who was there that day documenting war crimes by ISIS. He saw this rescue operation happening, and he just started filming it. After this man posted the footage online, it went viral, and before long, major news outlets all over the world were reaching out to Ephraim and the other volunteers for interviews. This was the story that me and my teammates in Virginia in that office saw in 2017, and that image we saw of Ephraim standing behind the tank with the AK-47, that was moments before he rushed out behind the tank and provided cover fire for Dave and the other to run over and grab the girl and the other 2 men. The gunshot wound that Ephraim sustained in his leg wound up being relatively minor, if you consider gunshot wounds to be minor. It did not hit an artery and it did not shatter his bone. And so after only a few months, he was more or less back to strength, and instead of just taking it easy, he was in another conflict zone in Burma, this time working with a new volunteer organization, one that he founded called Stronghold Rescue and Relief. And their mission is to protect and care for families in conflict zones. Their motto is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Despite being a very small organization, they are having enormous impacts all over the world, but they need our help. They rely on a small army of people who pitch in small donations every month to keep operations flowing. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please consider joining their army by supporting them on a monthly basis, just like I am. If you do, you'll not only gain my respect and admiration, you'll also get sent one of these awesome shirts with that amazing quote on the back. The link to join their army is in the description of this video. Also, if you just click on that link, it will bring you to their website and you can see the full unedited footage of their rescue mission. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please drop a 2,000-pound JDAM on the like button. Also, go support Stronghold Rescue and Relief by clicking the link in the video description. If you want to get in touch with me, you